This is the Zhiyun Crane M3 and this is the M3S, and they look very similar and you would probably struggle to tell them apart, but the M3S has some major upgrades. Now the question is, are those enough to justify buying it? Because even though these two gimbals look and feel very similar, in terms of internals and operational, they are very different. This is a major step up and a completely new gimbal. And let me tell you something, this is really good. But just because this is essentially a brand new gimbal, it doesn't mean that they ditched all the good things that the Crane M3 had. You still have the bicolor LED light, which it's really nice, very strong, which is perfect for vlogging or to film in low light conditions. And the LCD screen is also another area where I'm glad that they haven't compromised on, because this is a really nice screen that you can actually see on a bright daylight. The menus are very easy to navigate and very simple and straightforward. You can't really get lost on them. So that's really nice. It's a very simple and easy gimbal to use. And time-lapse and motion-lapse are still there, so if that's something that you're into, this gimbal is fantastic. Now, other than this, everything on the M3S is either improved on or brand new. So what are the improvements on this gimbal? Well, the base plate to start with has been improved, it's completely different, and I am really happy for this because I struggle a lot with the base plate on the Crane M3. As nice as it was, I was always fighting to get the camera on or off. So I'm really happy that they've completely redesigned the base plate, and now it's really easy to put the camera on and take it off. They've increased the payload and capacity of the gimbal by just lengthening some of the bars on each of the motors, and the redesign of the mounting bracket. And that means that I've been easily able to mount a 1.5 kilo camera with a fairly long 16 to 35mm lens. And the gimbal took it without a hitch, and I had no restrictions of movement whatsoever. I didn't have any parts of the camera hitting the gimbal because they've increased the length of the pan axis bar, which means that you have now more clearance for slightly beefier setups. Although I think the ideal setup is a compact camera with a compact lens and not so much a big full frame camera with a big ass lens, because this gimbal is designed for smaller compact camera setups, and in that regard it works really well. If there is one massive improvement of the M3S over the Crane M3, is the fact that you can now control all the main settings of the camera within the gimbal itself by just connecting the USB cable from the gimbal to the camera. It's as simple as that, and it works really well. It's surprisingly well, and you get control of the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, and believe it or not, the focus as well, which I think is fantastic. And you didn't have any of this with the Crane M3. If you wanted to have something similar to this, you had to get yourself the extension port and the Bluetooth adapter, and that was a bit fiddly to set up, but you wouldn't have manual control on the focus. And what it means is that if you need to do any creative filming, you can now focus by simply spinning the jog wheel here, and I think that's really nice. And you can access all these settings from the same screen, so you can switch from one setting to the other if you need to do some quick adjustments on the fly. And another thing that is really good is that you can set this jog wheel to control the panning or the tilting, and you can have some very small movements if you need it without having to rely on the joystick. And I think this is the best thing that Zhiyun could have done with the M3S, because they've reduced the overall size compared to the M3. As you can clearly see, it's much smaller because you don't need this extension port for the Bluetooth, and they've put everything inside the gimbal itself, and you just need a short cable from the gimbal to the camera and you get all that functionality built in. And let me tell you something, it's very smooth and well implemented. I am well impressed. And another area where they have made a major improvement is on the locking of the motors, because you can now find them on the actual bar of the motor rather than on the motor itself as it was on the M3. And it's really easy to find them, whereas with the M3 you had to find them as you were operating the gimbal, and it was just an absolute pain, whereas now it's very easy, you know exactly where they are at all times. So I think that's another major improvement that makes this gimbal a really nice gimbal overall. I could spend the next half an hour talking to you about the great things about this gimbal, but there are a few things that you need to have in place in order to get the best out of any gimbal. And the most important thing that you can do is to make sure that all three axes are correctly balanced. Now, you can't get away with having a gimbal halfway balanced or sort of balanced if you're in a pinch and you're in a rush. But if you want to get the smoothest and best footage out of your camera, you're gonna have to make sure that they are correctly balanced. This is not very difficult, and it just takes a little bit of practice, and after a while you'll probably be doing it in 2 or 3 minutes. And another thing that many people don't know about, but it's really important, is to go into the settings of the gimbal and adjust the deadband. This is something that most people ignore, and it can have a massive impact on the quality of the stabilization of your gimbal. Personally, I always set it to high so that I don't have any of those micro movements that you get when you operate the gimbal, and your gimbal will be smooth as silk. If you set it too low, it will be very responsive, and that's more for sports or similar environment. But if you want to have really nice and smooth shots, set it to high, and trust me on this, you're gonna get a really big improvement. Another thing that you might want to consider is to get a second grip point, because sometimes holding the gimbal like this might be a bit difficult to get really nice and stabilized shots. But if you have a second hand grip, you can get a much more stabilized footage, and on top of that, it will allow you to mount accessories on the handle itself rather than on the gimbal. So in my opinion, if you struggle with balancing or keeping your footage well stabilized, that could be something that you might want to consider. But one thing that is really important is to make sure that you keep it as light as possible on the camera itself, because you're going to be tempted to load it with accessories, microphones, lights, and all of that, and that's going to affect the balancing of the gimbal. So trust me when I tell you, keep it light, and that's going to give you the best results. The perfect gimbal doesn't exist, and this one isn't either. So these are the areas where I think this gimbal could improve on. And the first one is to do with vertical filming, because you can mount the camera vertically on the gimbal itself, but you are never going to be able to balance it properly. The gimbal will take it, but you feel that you're pushing the motors right up to the limit. And it has this vertical mode, but it's okay for a shot or two on the fly, but it's not ideal if you're going to be filming vertical for a long time or all day. Another area that they could improve on, and I don't know whether this is mechanical or they could do something on a firmware upgrade, is to allow you to have the motors either behind the camera as they are now, or at the front of the camera, similar to what the Zhiyun M6 does with the ultra wide setting. Because if you have a flip-up screen, you'll probably be fine. But if you have a camera that doesn't have a flip-up screen, that only has a screen that tilts up or down, sometimes the screen can be a little bit difficult to look at, especially if you go on low angle. So that would be a really nice feature that I wish they could implement. And another area that they could improve on is to do with vlogging and the C-Way player. Because even though you can control remotely the gimbal with the C-Way player, you cannot set keyframes for starting and end point. Similar to what you can do on a motion time-lapse, where you can set a start and end point, but obviously you need to do that manually on the gimbal itself. Whereas it would be really great if we could do this remotely with the C-Way player and adjust the start or the end point if we need to. That would be really easy to implement, I think, but would be very helpful. And finally, it's to do with the joystick, because even if you set it at the slowest pace, this is still too fast in my opinion, and slow should be really slow. And yes, you can control it with the jog wheel here, the tilting and the panning, but sometimes you wish you could have the same slow speed on the joystick itself. Now, does that mean that this gimbal is not good enough? Absolutely not. This is a fantastic gimbal. And did you know that there are some other very interesting and clever ways that you can use this gimbal other than the traditional way? For instance, you could attach the gimbal to a monopod and do crane shots, and these shots are amazing. They add so much production value to any video, but these shots usually are establishing shots, so you want to make sure that you keep the gimbal and the camera as light as possible. Do this and you're going to have incredible looking shots that you would have to pay a ton of money for otherwise. Another great use for a gimbal is to mount it on a motorized slider, especially if you are a solo content creator and you want a second camera or a second camera operator and you don't have a body or a person to help you. And this is great because the motorized slider will move sideways and the gimbal will do the rotation. especially if you use sliders from a company called YC Onion, because you can pair the gimbal to the slider through their app and set keyframes. Back to the point that I said earlier, that it would be really great if Zhiyun would allow this in the Seaway Play app, because otherwise you're limited to this brand of sliders. But this is a cool and unusual way to use a gimbal that will add additional functionality to your workflow. And lastly, if you have the budget and the know-how, you can attach the gimbal to a motorized slider upside down and get moving overhead shots. And believe me when I'm telling you, this is gonna add such an incredible production value to any video that you do, because traditionally these type of shots are done with motorized robotic arms, and you're gonna be able to cheat this effect and create absolutely amazing images. So these are 3 unique and different ways that you can use your gimbal other than in the traditional way, because a gimbal is more than just a gimbal if you put a little bit of imagination and thought into it. Is this a good gimbal? Yes, absolutely. Is it worth upgrading from the Crane M3? I think so, because only on the ability to control the camera from the gimbal itself, that alone to me would justify the upgrade. But there are so many more upgrades on this Crane M3S. I think if you buy this gimbal, you're gonna be very happy. It's not perfect, there is certainly room for improvement, but as a whole, this is a solid gimbal. It will work with cameras, it will work with smartphones. It's a lot packed into this small, tiny body. And I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.